Hey there, true believers. Welcome to another edition of JB Reads Comics for You, brought to you by BagBoardedAndBoxed.com and the Bill and Frank Eat Pop Culture YouTube channel. I'm your host of the most, JB, and today I'll be reading House of X number 1 and 2 and Powers of X number 1 for you. I'm still trying to find my voice and what it is I really want out of these videos. Any feedback, any suggestions you have, please leave a comment on the bagboardandbox.com, on the YouTube page, or feel free to hit up Bill or Frank on Twitter. I do not have a Twitter handle because, to quote Monty Python and the Holy Grail, 'tis a silly place. But I'd love to get your feedback. I want to talk a little bit about my history with the X-Men comics, what I think makes a good X-Men comic, and why it's so easy for X-Men comics to be kind of lousy. And then we'll jump into House of X and Powers of X and this relaunch of the X books. I first started reading X-Men comics when a lot of other people did in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Chris Claremont was still the writer. He was working with a number of excellent artists, Will Sportatio, Mark Silvestri, and of course Jim Lee most famously. The X books were immensely popular at that point. I went back afterwards and read Claremont's earlier run with John Byrne, the 10, 12 issues straight through from the Hellfire Club through Dark Phoenix Saga through Days of Future Past are, of course, probably the most seminal run of X-Men comics ever, along with another run of comics I'm going to talk about in a second here. They're my favorite X-Men comics as well. Claremont had a sustained 17 to 20 year run on the X-Men where he was the mastermind behind the entire franchise. It pretty much was running on all cylinders the whole way through. By the time I jumped into it, it was on its last legs. The X-Men comics were so popular that there were 4 or 5 different spin-offs. By the end of it, I think it had gotten out of Claremont's hand. I think he really just was no longer able to be the single visionary behind the X-Men books. There were just too many fingers and pies at that point. He really lost control of the narrative. Claremont was always really strong at introducing new characters, but I think that got out of hand as well. One of the reasons why I think writers like writing X-Men comics is they're not beholden to a lot of the traditional characters the way writing other sort of seminal comics is. You know, if you jump on Superman or Batman or Spider-Man, you're pretty much writing Peter Parker, Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne. You don't have a lot of options there. Whereas because of the nature of mutants, there's a lot of room to tell a lot of different stories, introduce new characters. You're not really stuck with writing the same characters over and over again. After Claremont left, the X-Men comics really struggled, like everything struggled in the mid 90s and late 90s. Not to keep hitting the same points here, but Joe Quesada took over Marvel and he poached a British writer who was brought over to Vertigo Comics in the early 90s, and then he came over to Marvel and wrote some great stuff. I know this sounds very familiar because there was a familiar theme here in how Joe Quesada turned around Marvel. In this case, Joe Quesada was poaching Grant Morrison. I really appreciate Grant Morrison's writing, but it's hard for me to get emotionally invested in it. I know Bill is not a fan of Grant Morrison at all. I think he's a very good writer. He keeps the reader at arm's length. He's very conceptually kind of odd. He works with Frank Quitely a lot, who also has a very odd artistic style. It's really good, but it can be somewhat off-putting. One of the Claremont strengths was he used plot to develop character. So he would introduce the Phoenix Force in order to create drama between Scott Summers, Cyclops, and Jean Grey, Marvel Girl, and ultimately kill her one of many times that she's died and of course been resurrected, because this is comic books and comic book death. This makes me think of Lost, where Damon Lindelof always was using the plot of the island to develop the characters that had crashed. The point wasn't to answer all these questions. What is the island? Why is there a six-toed statue, etc.? It was really to use that to develop Jack and Kate and Sawyer. I think that was why some fans were so frustrated by the finale of Lost, but I really enjoyed it because at the end it brought it back to the sort of emotional core of these characters and what they went through and how it brought them together. Grant Morrison is a lot more like the writers behind Westworld, which I enjoy as a show, but it's very, very dense and plot heavy, and it's much more interested in keeping the viewer on their toes than it is in really emotionally investing the viewer in the Westworld characters. And that's very much the way I feel about Grant Morrison's work. Is I really appreciate it. I think it's very well plotted, intricately plotted, but I don't have the emotional investment in the X-Men characters when Grant Morrison's writing them that I did when Chris Claremont was writing them. This is one of the first pages from his E is for Extinction, his first arc on New X-Men. This is the end of the previous issue where Genosha, which is this island nation that Claremont had introduced back in the 1980s, is destroyed by Sentinels. So Genosha was this sort of XP for South Africa, and I'm assuming that people who are watching this video know a lot about mutants and how they are these sort of stand-ins for cultural minorities in the United States. It was mostly African Americans when Stan Lee introduced the characters. You see in X2 and Bobby Drake reveals he's a mutant to his parents, how that's sort of treated like he's coming out of the closet to his parents. So Genosha was this sort of apartheid state that was similar to South Africa. Eventually it was taken over by Magneto and used as a sort of Zionist home for mutants. And there were 16 million mutants living on Genosha at the time, and the Sentinels wiped out the entire population of Genosha. And it's an important plot point because when there were still these 16 million mutants, mutant kind was actually rather quickly overtaking humanity as the dominant species on the planet. So wiping them out set mutant kind back several years in their evolution as the dominant species on the planet. So some of the other stories that Grant Morrison jumped into were this riot at Professor Xavier's school where mutant Quentin Quire kidnapped Xavier and took over the school. Thematically, similar to more militant in the Magneto side versus less militant Xavier side, more integrationist. And again, I'm bringing up a lot of these themes because they're going to be very important in House of X and Powers of X. But I will say that when this is done really well and when there's done with some subtlety, or when it's done with a level of almost satire, the way Grant Morrison did it, these metaphors for the real world can be very effective. Bad X books are the X books where there's no subtlety and where it really hits you over the head like an anvil with the comparisons between real world and mutants. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that I have two favorite X-Men arcs, the first one being the Claremont Byrne run, and the second one being Joss Whedon and John Cassaday's Astonishing X-Men. The reason I enjoy this more than Grant Morrison's run is Whedon really used the X-Men comics to develop X-Men characters rather than either doing weird plot things like Grant Morrison or really jumping into the mutant human dynamic and its parallels to the real world. He wanted to use these plots to develop his primary X-Men. Good X-Men books, again, tend to fall on a spectrum between very well plotted in the Grant Morrison vein or very emotionally satisfying, which is more in the Chris Claremont, Joss Whedon vein. Not that Whedon and Claremont aren't good at the plotting, but their plot always serviced the characters in a way that Grant Morrison's didn't. And my preference is always going to tend to be more towards the latter. So one of the reasons I really love the Astonishing X-Men run with Whedon and Cassaday is because it's really about the relationship between these two women, Emma Frost and Kitty Pryde, and its development. At the beginning, they're very, very distrustful. By the end of the series, they almost become friends, and they had come to respect and trust one another. At its core, it was all about these characters, these core X-Men characters, and how that plot would move these characters along, rather than taking this overarching view of all of mutant kind and what was happening with mutant kind and how it could be paralleled to the real world. So I also feel like I need to address the elephant in the room, which is some of the corporate shenanigans that have gone on as far as the X-Men comics over the last decade. Since the X-Men movies were farmed out to Fox, and then Marvel subsequently created their own movie studio, they've seemed increasingly reluctant to really put good writers in their prime on X-Men books. They did put Brian Michael Bendis, who at that point had completely lost his fastball on the X-Men books. So I don't think it was that they totally didn't give a shit, but the X-Men books have just been really terrible since Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men run. So I had gotten totally out of X-Men, and the plot has been very, very difficult to follow. So there's a couple of things that have been going on in the X-Men comics over the last year or so. The X-Men and mutant kind in general were nearly wiped out by the Terrigen Mist because supposedly Marvel was trying to replace the X-Men with the Inhumans, which again is such an unrealistic idea that I can't imagine it's actually true. But who knows? Maybe it really was something going on in the corporate back offices of Marvel. I'm not sure. I do know there was a thing where they couldn't create new characters because those characters would automatically fall under the purview of Fox rather than Marvel. So they were very reluctant to create new characters, which is why they kept eliminating a lot of X-Men. But I would also say that that's part of the fact that the entire continuity of X-Men had gotten so out of hand that they really need to reduce the number of characters down to the ones who really cared about. If you need to get a little bit of a refresher on what's been going on over the last couple of years, you can go back and check out this Polygon article, this Age of X-Man story, which has been this big X-Men run over the last year where this time-traveling version of Cable pulled the X-Men into this alternate world where mutants were not feared, but they were loved, and they kind of ruled the world as a utopia. Meanwhile, Wolverine, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Professor X have all died and come back to life. After most of the mutants were pulled into this Age of X-Man world, Cyclops and Wolverine were left with a very small group of mutants that were remaining to fight off this government effort to basically end the mutant race. So I did go back and read the last two issues of Matthew Rosenberg's Uncanny X-Men run and the last issue of this Age of X-Man arc, and these comics are terrible. So I do not think you need to go back and read them in order to jump onto House of X and Powers of X. If you just want an example of really lousy comic book storytelling, Matthew Rosenberg is your guy, and so are the folks on Age of X-Man. Matthew Rosenberg was down to this, along with Wolverine, as his final X-Men team. Again, there's some corporate shenanigans going on here. Supposedly, when Rosenberg was brought onto the book, Marvel already knew that Jonathan Hickman was going to be relaunching the X-Men titles, and Rosenberg was kind of playing out the string. He'll go along to get along, which, yeah, nothing wrong with that. You get to write comic books for a living, man, so good. More power to you, brother. Anytime you have an X-Men book where you have Cyclops and then these folks as your primary X-Men, you know you're running into some trouble. And the artwork on this Uncanny X-Men run is Salvador Larroca. Larroca has been an artist on X-Men for a while. I'm not really in love with his style. So, for instance, we have this shot of Emma Frost here, and yeah, she's hot. But for one thing, where's her right arm? I think she's holding her cape back, but initial view, it just looks like he forgot to draw her right arm. Larroca also has a real tendency to look like he's doing digital tracing of faces, that sort of Greg Land thing. The biggest problem with this run is, like, the stakes are just not existent. So, you have characters that have been around for a while, but people don't really care about. This is page 17 out of 27, and this is the first real action sequence we get. There's been a lot of talking for 17 pages, and then they're fighting off this government sentinel, and Banshee attacks him, and then Banshee gets killed, and it's just like, it's totally low stakes. You just don't really give a shit because you know that it's about to be relaunched, and Jonathan Hickman's going to undo pretty much everything that Matthew Rosenberg's doing. I guess if I'd maybe read all 20 issues prior to this, I might have had a little more emotional investment in what was happening, but I just flat out didn't. But that's got nothing on this Age of X-Man book, which I am really, really happy I skipped, because these folks just turned in what is got to be one of the worst comics I've ever read as a culmination of a major multi-series crossover event. The artwork is just terrible. Like, this is supposed to be a huge climactic issue, and this is the art that's being turned in. But to make a long story short, the X-Men that are in this alternate universe end up returning back to the primary reality, which becomes kind of important in the last issue of the Uncanny X-Men that Rosenberg wrote, because I actually read this before I read the Age of X-Men, and without context, the ending of this issue is the worst kind of Deus Ex Machina, and it probably still is, even knowing the context. But, again, talkie, talkie, talkie. This is the first page of the issue. More talkie, talkie, talkie. More talkie, talkie, talkie. More talkie, talkie, talkie. Emma Frost found a way to make humans forget that mutants existed, so they can't even see mutants even when they're using their powers. But it's kind of this weird thing where like Cyclops is wandering around in his costume and people aren't noticing him. So is this like the Christmas episode of Black Mirror where like people can't see John Hamm anymore? Like his face is blotted out, because that kind of sounds awful. And if they can see them, they just can't see them use their powers, then why is no one noticing that Cyclops is wearing a costume? It's just really stupid and weird. And again, just like bad artwork, like the Hellfire Club is supposed to be on a street in the Upper East Side and was established like that previously, but now the Sentinels are flying towards it, and somehow it's like right in the middle of Central Park where nothing is except for Tavern on the Green. Yeah, I just think LaRocca is just lazy and didn't think about this drawing compared to the other drawings he was doing. And then I guess because this is a 36 page issue, they actually had to switch up artists right in the middle of the comic book because LaRocca couldn't handle the art load. We have our Deus Ex Machina here, where the X-Men from the Age of X-Men reappear and save Wolverine and Cyclops' bacon at the last second. It's supposed to give you like this big emotional jump, but it just doesn't, because Rosenberg just, at least as far as I can tell, just didn't do any of the work required to have this kind of payoff. We do get a nice reunion between Jean and Cyclops, and some kind of bootylicious looking Jean there, which I'm a fan of. I believe Jean was resurrected, but at that point Cyclops had died, and then when Cyclops was resurrected, Jean had gone into the Age of X-Men. So this is actually the first time they've seen each other since both of them have come back to life. That's, I guess, kind of a payoff, but it's, it really just, again, is... We leave off where Cyclops destroys this Cerebro helmet that Emma Frost has been using to wipe humans' memory of mutants, and mutants are once again revealed to the world. And Cyclops says, "We have always been at war," which again is kind of antithetical to Professor Xavier's dream. The idea of the X-Men is that they're not at war with humankind. They're the hope for integration between humans and mutants. This is much more like something Magneto would say, which again is going to be kind of a theme in House of X, and some of the questions I have about the book and where it's going. So let's jump into that and stay as far away from these Matthew Rosenberg and whomever those awful writers were on Age of X-Men as you possibly can. So digging into House of X #1, we have two parallel miniseries happening, but they're really one 12-issue miniseries. So House of X is going to be 6 issues running every other week. And then in the off weeks, you'll have Powers of X. They're both being written by Jonathan Hickman. You do need to read one to understand the other. It really is just one long miniseries with 2 different artists and one single writer, Jonathan Hickman, relaunching the X-Men series. Well, Hickman puts in these really cool interstitial pages, and I want to dig deeper into these because as far as where Hickman falls on the plot versus emotional character development, he's definitely more on the Grant Morrison plot side, as we're going to see. But he does such a great job of the world building. It's probably my favorite parts of the series so far, and I'm definitely going to dig in real deep into those parts. So we open with this really weird shot of Scott Summers and others coming out of this pod. Professor Xavier saying his kind of classic line, his first line from the very first issue of X-Men, "To me, my X-Men." But it's done in this very weird way. Pepe Larraz is not Frank Quitely, but he's definitely elected to go in the direction of a weird art style. There's a lot of parallels between this House of X and New X-Men, which is not a bad thing at all. I think that Hickman has a lot of work to do fixing all the issues when it comes to mutant comic books. I can see why he made that decision. So then we get to these shots of Colossus and Storm and Iceman planting these flowers from Krakoa in all these different locations around the world and even on Mars and the moon and Jerusalem. And I think that's going to be an important plot point as well because, as we're talking about with Genosha, I think Hickman's really going to lean into this Zionist idea of them having a place for themselves in the world and how that frightens humanity. It's not super subtle. I think there's some deliberateness in how he's going about it and reason why the X-Men don't really feel very heroic in these books so far. So a bunch of ambassadors go to this embassy of mutant kind in their new nation of Krakoa, which is this living island that was in Giant Size X-Men #1. I think Krakoa has changed a lot over the last 40-something years. So if I say something about Krakoa, I'm going to end up probably being wrong. Oddly enough, Magneto is the ambassador for mutant kind in this meeting with these ambassadors from the UK, the US, China, and a couple of other nations, which is confusing because he's typically a villain, although a sympathetic one. When Hickman had his big rise in Marvel was pretty much paralleled exactly when I fell out with Marvel. He was under mostly Axel Alonso's regime, which is when I stepped out because I detested Axel Alonso's regime. I've heard great things about his run on Avengers and Fantastic Four, and so far I'm enjoying his writing here. Again, he's very heavy into plot. He's a lot like a fantasy writer in that, he's very interested in developing and building this world, so far at least, to the exclusion of developing some of the characters within that world, but I want to give him a little bit of rope. The concept is that the mutants are going to create a nation state the way they have with Genosha on Krakoa. In order to get the rest of the world to recognize them, they're offering these flowers from Krakoa that offer these amazing medical marvels. I want to highlight, though, some of the oddness here and why I think not everything is the way it seems. For one thing, we never see Professor Xavier without this Cerebro helmet on. The least obvious thing is that this is actually Professor Xavier and this is what he wants to do. Everything is indicating that he's like a villain or he's not really himself. Even this weird panel here, like this is Wolverine. Wolverine doesn't play with kids. Like that's not Wolverine's character. So there's something weird going on here. He's trying to create this feeling of unease in the reader about what's going on. We're not supposed to take everything at face value. The simple idea that Professor Xavier would be creating a separatist Zionist nation of mutants is counter to everything that Xavier has stood for previously. He's always been one for integrating mutants into society, that mutants and humans can peacefully coexist. This is much more Magneto's platform than Xavier's. I'm going to be very fascinated to see how they develop what's happening here with Xavier and how he's come to this point, if it's really him or the more obvious thing is that it's not really him and that everything is not as it seems and this is a villainous plot. Because I will say that the X-Men come off like villains in a lot of this comic book. So again, cool interstitials. We get a map of Krakoa, its location in the world. I love maps. Part of, I think, the fantasy fan of me always loves maps. They're always the beginning of fantasy books. Remember this series called No Man's Land with this Batman series, which wasn't very good, but always had these cool maps at the beginning of Gotham and who had taken over what parts of Gotham. And those maps were eventually used in the Christopher Nolan movies to give Nolan an idea of the geography of Gotham, and they were even used as the subway backgrounds. So I always love maps and things like that in comic books, and I think it really adds to developing the world of these comics. So each of the interstitials jumps into these different chapters, and here we're getting a chapter where these humans are out on this space station off of the sun. This station is being built as a doomsday fallback for humanity. They've been noticing the more aggressive tendencies of mutant kind and their quickly expanding population, and this is a response, is building this station called the Forge, which its central hub is a Sentinel. I would be very disappointed if this ends up with like your standard late period X-Men, humans are all bad, mutants are all good. I think that's the least kind of intelligent X-Men storytelling. I'm sure there's political reasons why you want to tell that story, especially right now. It's just not interesting to me, and I certainly have no interest in Xavier kind of like becoming more militant, a Magneto kind of character. But obviously, it's not a particularly good idea for humanity to be using a Sentinel to charge their Doomsday fallback device. So this Forge station is part of something called the Orcus Protocol, which was initiated as a doomsday network because of humanity's concern of their own extinction. Obviously, the concern here is that they're working with agents of Hydra, and it does lead to sort of this idea that humanity might be villainous in this. But we do also get this cool background about how we've seen these three things happen with mutants as the reason why they've initiated this doomsday protocol, that the population is spiking after the Genosian genocide, this financial change because that's destabilizing in the pharmaceutical and other industries with this cocoa flower, and this territorial change in that mutants have established their own nation. So this is pretty much our only major action sequence in the book, and it's Mystique and Sabretooth and Toad robbing damage control, which is where things from these battles between superhumans get stored. And the battle scene is fine. It's very brief. The Fantastic Four show up. This is probably the worst part of the whole issue. One of the biggest problems with mutants in the Marvel Universe is that when you really think about it, it doesn't totally make sense. If, the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, Captain America are supposed to be sort of special. They've gotten these powers, but now you have also people just developing powers naturally who are eventually going to surpass the human population. It makes the other characters besides the mutants feel less special. And I think it's why mutants have always been sort of segmented from the rest of the Marvel Universe. And whenever they get integrated, with the exception of Wolverine, who always has to pop up in everything, it can kind of break kayfabe a little bit because, it just doesn't make sense that mutants would be so feared, but the Fantastic Four so loved, and that the Fantastic Four would be so special, but mutants are making them totally not special because there's so many other people with powers. They've escaped through this portal to Krakoa, and the Fantastic Four have captured only Sabretooth of the three. Mystique and Toad got away, but then Cyclops comes out and greets the Fantastic Four, and he has this standoff with the Fantastic Four where he's basically saying, I'm an ambassador of a nation. I want Sabretooth because he's protected. And Reed Richards says, I'm going to have a problem with that. And Scott kind of backs down. He has this dialogue with Sue Storm. Cyclops, this amnesty, the other thing Xavier's doing. What are all of you thinking? And Cyclops says, my family has spent our entire lives being hunted and hated. The world has told me I was less when I knew I was more. Do you honestly think we're going to sit around forever and just take it? Of course not, but it's really very simple, Susan. I believe in what Xavier is doing. Please greet your son for me and tell him when he's ready. He has family on Krakoa waiting for him. I can't help but read these pages and not really feel like Cyclops is a hero here. He kind of comes off like a villain. This whole sequence, I guess there's people that would be sympathetic to this viewpoint. To me, it's almost like the scene in Lethal Weapon 2 where the evil South Africans, who are the propagators of apartheid, are talking about diplomatic immunity. Like, it's just very weird for the X-Men to be taking this kind of position. One of the reasons why I loved Astonishing X-Men was Whedon really brought it back to, the X-Men have to be seen like superheroes to give a positive image for mutants. And everything so far in this book is not giving a particularly positive image. They're kind of forcing their way into this nationhood, which is, fine, and it's an interesting concept, but it doesn't make them come off particularly heroic. This is not, a feeling about real-world analogies for Zionist states and things like that, but it's just this very sort of odd and off-putting way that the mutants are depicted, which leads me to believe that there's something else going on here, because if this is being played straight, then I'm not really sure how much further down the rabbit hole I'm going to want to go after this miniseries. And then we get this cool file on Omega-level mutants. Some of them have been revealed previously, like Jean Grey, Magneto, and Iceman, who was always thought was kind of weird as an Omega-level mutant. Maybe neither here nor there, and there's maybe corporate reasons why Iceman is being considered an Omega-level mutant, but I'll leave it at that. And these Omega level mutants are important because they're basically could be seen in humanity's eyes as weapons of mass destruction. So by having all these Omega level mutants in one place and not being at odds with each other the way Xavier and Magneto were previously, it could be seen as they're stockpiling these mutant versions of weapons of mass destruction. So finally we get back to these ambassadors who are visiting the Krakoa embassy in Jerusalem, and it turns out that the Cuckoo sisters have been reading their minds, and all of these ambassadors actually have ulterior motives. And finally we get this shot of Magneto looking again extremely villainous despite his white costume, saying, "You see, I know how you humans love your symbolism almost as much as you love your religion. And I needed you to understand. You have new gods now." Not a particularly heroic sentiment in a comic book that's ostensibly about superheroes. All right, so jumping into Powers of X number 1, it's not technically Powers of X, it's actually Powers of 10. And this one has some trippy jumping through time and showing these future consequences. This is something the X-Men books have always been interested in, going back to Days of Future Past. So we open with a shot of Xavier in X0, which is X to the power of 0. So it's year 1. And that's your more normal looking Professor Xavier from 10 years ago. And then you get X to the power of 10, which is now. You have Xavier in this Cerebro helmet. X to the power of 2, which is 100 years from now. And finally, X to the power of 3, which is year 1000. This comic book goes into all of these different time periods. It's very hard to tell what's going on and how this is all going to come together, because Hickman definitely has this very big master plot that he's building towards, and he's laying a lot of groundwork here that's going to come to fruition 8 issues from now. So in X to the power of 0, we get this meet cute, or what you think is a meet cute, between Professor Xavier and Moira McTaggart. And as it turns out, she's actually been here specifically looking for Professor Xavier, who recently had this dream of a better world, his Martin Luther King version of mutant-human integration. And she tells him we go back quite a ways, even though Professor Xavier's never met her before. She asks him to read her mind. We don't know what he sees until House of X number 2. Powers of X number 1 is, in this series, going to be drawn by R.B. Silva. I don't like him quite as much as Pepe Larraz for Hickman's writing style. He's a little more cartoony. I think Hickman demands this hyper weird sort of world that he's building. He needs an artist that can bring that out, like a Frank Quitely style artist, and I'm not sure that Silva is quite as capable of that as Larraz is. I think Larraz is going to end up being a superstar from doing this series. So we get our one check into X to the power of 1, which is the current time period that was where the entire House of X number 1 took place. And Mystique brings back whatever it was she stole from Damage Control to Professor Xavier. We're not quite sure what it is. It's a recurring theme that we're not sure exactly what's going on. And we're going to get some reveals in House of X number 2, but we're still going to have a lot of open-ended questions after this. But again, we get this sort of weird view of Professor Xavier saying, "We're building a better mutant world, Mystique, and everyone who would live in it owes something," which is not a very Professor Xavier thing to say. And then we jump to year 100, or X to the power of 2, which is this post-apocalyptic world. These new Sentinels and these Sentinel-human hybrids are at war with mutant kind. But as it turns out, they've also been breeding mutants specifically to fight against other mutants and using them to betray and track them. Meanwhile, we have these other 2 mutants, and there's also been some genetic modification going on. 100 years from now, we have these mutants that are very similar to Nightcrawler, both in their teleportation abilities and also their religious and pacifist mentality. And then we have these other mutants who are a cross between, looks like Magic, who's Colossus' sister, and a couple of other breeds. There was this mutant breeding program between X1, X to the power of 1, and X to the power of 2, where Mr. Sinister had used these breeding pits on Mars to interbreed mutants to be more aggressive and militaristic. And there were 4 generations, this breeding in these 3 generations, it was less and less successful until basically it collapsed. Or maybe the best bit of characterization so far in this Hickman series, or at least the first issue of Powers of X and House of X, is this villainous Sentinel character. And I like his reaction to her saying, "If it takes 1,000 years, I swear I will endure and erase you from existence." That's the spirit, I love it! So we have this almost affably evil villain in the X to Power of 2 timeline, like the mayor from Buffy Season 3, which is usually one of my favorite kinds of villains. Meanwhile, the other 2 mutants have escaped, and as it turns out, Wolverine is still alive along with Zorn and someone who looks like Magneto, but how he could be alive 100 years from now, we don't really know. And we leave off at, all right, then follow me, the old man's waiting. So, again, a lot of build up, not a lot of big reveals in this Powers of X #1. And finally, we get X to the power of 3, which is 1,000 years from now, and we see the same character that our affably evil villain put in this tube, who is still in there 900 years later, and these odd alien-like beings are viewing the data from 900 years prior. So I'm getting very into the plot of this, and I didn't want to do that. But the plot is so dense that it's hard to really kind of analyze the overarching story because there's just so much going on, and there's so much that we don't know the answers to yet. So, for instance, there's this dome 1,000 years from now where they keep remnants of history, and it turns out that Cro-Magnon-looking humans are being kept in this dome. Finally, jumping over to House of X issue 2, where we finally start getting at least some reveals for what's going on, or at least where this story's going. This is probably the most important issue so far as explaining how it is that Jonathan Hickman is going to fix the mistakes of the last decade of Marvel Comics mutant writing. And there's even some canny nods to how miserable the X-Men books have been for the last decade. And oddly enough, Moira McTaggart is going to be central to this plot, and they're basically going to retcon the entire Moira McTaggart character and her history with the X-Men, which is why she's in the middle of this kaleidoscopic cover page. So we get this reveal that Moira's second life began in utero, and in the womb, she was already fully sentient and had a perfect recollection of her prior life where she lived a normal life as a school teacher. And the reason for this is that she's actually a mutant, and her mutant power is reincarnation. Moira had always been treated like a human, and her close relationship with Charles, somewhat romantic, was sort of a analogy for a larger mutants and humans can coexist, or also the notion of, miscegenation between humans and mutants, and that's in the real world parallels of that. It's an interesting move to decide to use Moira as the pivot point here and completely retcon her history and 40 plus years of comic books. In her second life, she never gets a chance to meet Xavier, but she sees him reveal himself as a mutant on television, and she's going to go meet him, but on her way, she dies in a plane crash, and then jumps into her third life where she gets to know Xavier fairly well. So you have this sort of Groundhog Day for Moira. Her mutant power of reincarnation, she's not reliving a day, she's reliving her whole lifetime. My initial thought when reading this was, well, wait, that doesn't make sense because mutants only develop their powers when they're around age 13, because mutants have also been used as a metaphor for puberty, but Hickman is smarter than I am, so of course he addresses that. In her third life, she finds Xavier somewhat pompous, and she decides that the best thing that she can do to fix the rift between humanity and mutant kind is develop a cure for mutants, which is a theme from Whedon's Astonishing X-Men. But then she's captured by Mystique and Destiny in her third life, and Destiny's mutant power is her ability to see the future. So she knows what Moira is trying to do, and as a militant mutant, or just a mutant who wants to protect her race, she wants to make sure that Moira is not successful at wiping out mutant kind with this cure. So we get these different perspectives between Moira and Destiny. Moira sees this as a cure for people that want it. Destiny sees it as something that's going to be forced upon mutant kind because mankind wants to eliminate their entire race. And Destiny tells her that she has 10 lives to live, maybe 11 if she's lucky, if Moira dies before her mutant power manifests, she won't reincarnate back to when she was a baby. So it's very complicated X-Men weird timeline shit that you get into with X-Men stuff. But it's also kind of a cool concept, and it's one where I feel like Hickman thought it out and covered his bases, because my immediate flag Hickman had called within 3 pages. So to teach Moira a lesson, they have Pyro burn her alive, ending her 3rd life. In this one, she meets and becomes lovers with Professor Xavier. And here we get possibly some retconning of the X-Men. So we'll see later that Moira has already gone past this 4th life. So I think what Hickman's doing is parts of Moira's multiple lives are going to be things that actually took place in the X-Men continuity, like them bring the team together and then bring the second team together in Giant Size X-Men. But then other years, like the Lost Decade, where you have this grim and gritty Cyclops who became this militant anti-human mutant that fought the Avengers, and Wolverine is now a lost decade that Hickman can use Moira McTaggart to potentially remove from the equation by excising these alternate timelines. Because we get this chart at the end of the comic that shows us 9 out of the 10 lives that Moira's lived. And obviously, one of the big things that fans are wondering about is why Life 6 is not listed here. I think this is going to be an introduction of alternate timelines. As Moira is reincarnated, the positive things that happen, she's going to want to continue to have happen, but then she's going to want to avoid the negative things. So the X-Men coming together is a positive, so Moira's going to want to make that happen in the timeline. But maybe the last decade of lousy X-Men comics, Moira's going to want to avoid. So if we, as the reader, are seeing this through the eyes of Moira's lifetimes, then ultimately whatever lifetime she ends up on, which will probably be either Life 10 or Life 11, potentially the things that we've seen over the last decade occurred in, Life 4, Life 5, something like that. So it's kind of an interesting concept and an interesting way to get around all the lousy work that Matthew Rosenberg and the people I was referring to earlier did. So we jump through some other lifetimes. We get her 5th life, where she reveals herself to Xavier much earlier, and he tries to create a mutant utopia. The Sentinels come and destroy it. Then she trains to be an assassin and kills all the Bolivar Trask family that created the Sentinels in Life 7 in order to avoid the Sentinel attack. But when even that doesn't work, in Life 8, she brings herself to Magneto, deciding that maybe Xavier's way is the wrong way, and perhaps Magneto was right all along. And when that life doesn't work out, she goes to Apocalypse and becomes one of his acolytes to help him gather the Horsemen to really stick it to humanity. And then, coming full circle, in Life 10, we get back to X-Zero 10 years ago, when she first meets Xavier in the Powers of X #1. So, very confusing, very convoluted, possibly. If you read all 3 issues, it totally makes sense. Compared to how convoluted X-Men comics have gotten in general, I actually think this is a rather elegant way to maybe undo a lot of the damage that's been done over the last decade. Now we realize in this, seeing these same panels with the new context of knowing Moira's reincarnation, and that we're now in her 10th life, when Xavier reads her mind, he's actually reading all 9 of her previous lifetimes and is aware of her mutant ability and the consequences of the decisions that she's seen. So again, we're getting this Groundhog Day supernatural mystery spot, I guess Russian Doll, which I've never watched, but that concept blown out by Jonathan Hickman as a way to say, well, if you didn't like that mutant story, that was Moira's Life 4, or now I'm rewrite mine is Moira's Life 10, which is she's going to take all the good things from her previous life and try to make them happen to be successful. So it's a very cool concept if it works. Again, I could be very wrong here, but this feels like Hickman's way of getting out of all the damage that's been done to the X-Men books over the last decade. That is House of X 1 and 2, Powers of X #1. This might be the longest video I've ever done. I definitely got really deep into the plot mechanics, and I apologize, but as I said earlier, X-Men books tend to be very, very plot heavy and science fiction-y, or they use the plot more as a device for the emotional development of the characters. Hickman is very much on the former side, very similar to Grant Morrison in that way, and he really does a great job of world building with all these interstitial panels, and he'd be a great fantasy or sci-fi writer if he ever wanted to get out of comic books. And I'm really glad he's in comic books because so far I'm really enjoying this series. So I definitely give it a thumbs up so far. I will say I have some hesitancy about the direction of the book. From what we've seen from Marvel over the Axel Alonso era, he could be forthright in this sort of militaristic, villainous turn for the X-Men because he might not see this as villainous at all. But I hope that's not the case. I hope that there's something else going on here. I hope he has some more interesting turns. I definitely didn't see what happened in House of X #2 coming at all. So, hopefully he's not going to do something as obvious as Professor Xavier has really been taken over and mind controlled by somebody else. And he has a grander plot than that. And I think this is really cool. I definitely give it a thumbs up. So let me know what you thought of House of X #1, Powers of X #1, and especially House of X #2. Leave a comment on the YouTube page for this video. Leave a comment over at bagboardandbox.com. I'd really love to get your feedback on these videos. Thanks so much for checking this video out, and I'll catch you on the flip side.